The silence of deep space was shattered by a single, piercing sound. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a signal, faint yet persistent, cutting through the static of the void. On the bridge of the mining ship Starwood, the crew froze. Their instruments had picked up something unusual, something that didn't belong in the cold, empty expanse of the galaxy. "What is that?" asked the navigator, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes were fixed on the screen in front of him, where a series of strange symbols flickered. The captain, a seasoned veteran with streaks of gray in his hair, leaned forward. His face was calm, but his heart raced. He had spent decades in space, and he had never heard anything like this. "Play it again," he ordered. The signal crackled through the speakers. It was a series of tones, rhythmic and deliberate, like a language. But it wasn't just any language. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. The tones sounded familiar. "It's not just random noise," said the communications officer, a young woman with sharp eyes. "It's a pattern. A message." The captain nodded slowly. "Can we trace its origin?" The navigator's fingers flew across the console. "It's coming from a planet in an uncharted system. About 3 days' journey from here." The crew fell silent. Uncharted systems were dangerous. No one knew what lay beyond the edges of the map. But the signal, it was calling to them. "We should report this to command," said the engineer, a burly man with a cautious demeanor. "Let them send a proper team." The captain hesitated. Reporting it would mean waiting weeks, maybe months, for a response. And by then, the signal might be gone. He looked around at his crew. They were tired, worn down by months of hard work in the depths of space. But he could see the curiosity in their eyes. The same curiosity that burned in his own chest. "We're going to check it out," he said finally. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but no one argued. They had all felt it, the pull of the unknown, the thrill of discovery. 3 days later, the Starwood entered orbit around the planet. It was a barren, rocky world, its surface scarred by ancient craters and jagged mountains. But as they scanned the surface, they found something that made their blood run cold. "Captain," said the navigator, his voice trembling. "There's a structure down there. It's massive." The captain stared at the screen. The structure was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was ancient, its edges worn smooth by time, but it was unmistakably artificial. And it was human. "Prepare the landing team," he said, his voice steady. "We're going down." As the shuttle descended through the thin atmosphere, the crew could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. They were about to step onto a world that no human had ever seen, to uncover secrets that had been buried for millennia. But as they approached the structure, a sense of unease settled over them. The signal had led them here, but now it was silent. The only sound was the wind, howling across the desolate landscape. The shuttle touched down, and the crew stepped out onto the alien soil. The structure loomed above them, its dark walls casting long shadows in the dim light of the distant sun. "Let's move," said the captain, leading the way. As they entered the structure, they found themselves in a vast, empty chamber. The walls were covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly in the darkness. And in the center of the room, there was a pedestal. On the pedestal was a holographic device. The captain reached out and activated it. The room was suddenly filled with light, and a figure appeared before them. It was humanoid, but not human. Its features were sharp and angular, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. The figure spoke, its voice echoing through the chamber. "If you are hearing this, then you are of our kind. You are the last hope. Beware the enemy. They are coming." The hologram flickered and disappeared, leaving the crew in stunned silence. The captain turned to his crew, his face grim. "We need to find out what happened here. And we need to do it fast." But as they began to explore the structure, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, something stirred. The crew moved cautiously through the ancient structure, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty halls. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to tell a story. But it was a story none of them could understand, not yet. The captain led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The holographic message still echoed in his mind. Beware the enemy. They are coming. Who were they? And why had this civilization left such a warning for humanity? Captain, look at this, called the communications officer. She was standing in front of a large mural, her flashlight illuminating the carvings. The mural depicted a great battle, ships in the sky, explosions lighting up the ground, and figures fleeing in terror. The captain studied the mural closely. The figures were humanoid, but their faces were twisted in fear. Above them loomed a shadowy figure, its shape indistinct but menacing. "It's a warning," said the engineer, his voice low. "They're showing us what happened to them." The captain nodded. "Keep looking. There has to be more." As they moved deeper into the structure, they found more murals, each one more detailed than the last. The story they told was clear: a thriving civilization, advanced and peaceful, had been attacked by an enemy they couldn't defeat. The enemy was relentless, destroying everything in its path. "This doesn't make sense," said the navigator, shaking his head. "If they were so advanced, how did they lose?" "Maybe they weren't prepared," said the communications officer. "Or maybe the enemy was just too powerful." The captain didn't answer. He was too focused on the murals. There was something about them, something familiar. The way the figures moved, the way they fought, it was almost human. Finally, they reached the heart of the structure. It was a massive chamber, filled with strange machines and glowing crystals. In the center of the room was a large console, covered in more of the strange symbols. "This must be where they controlled everything," said the engineer, running his hand over the console. "If we can figure out how to work it, we might be able to learn more." The captain nodded. "Do it." The engineer worked quickly, his fingers flying over the console. After a few moments, the room came to life. The crystals glowed brighter, and the machines hummed with energy. A holographic map appeared in the air, showing the planet as it had been thousands of years ago. The crew stared in awe. The planet had been beautiful once, with lush forests and sparkling oceans. But the map changed, showing the planet being consumed by fire and darkness. "This is what happened to them," said the captain, his voice heavy with sadness. "They were destroyed. But there was more." The map zoomed out, showing the galaxy. The enemy's path of destruction was marked in red, spreading from system to system. "They're still out there," said the navigator, his voice trembling. "And they're coming for us." The captain clenched his fists. "We need to find out everything we can. If this enemy is still out there, we need to be ready." As they continued to explore the chamber, they found something that made their blood run cold. It was a small, sealed container, hidden in a corner of the room. Inside was a single crystal, glowing with a soft, blue light. "What is that?" asked the communications officer. The captain picked up the crystal, feeling its warmth in his hand. "I don't know," he said. "But I think it's important." As soon as he touched it, the room was filled with light. The holographic figure from before appeared again, but this time, it spoke directly to them. "You have found the key," it said. "But beware. The enemy will stop at nothing to destroy it. Protect it at all costs." The hologram flickered and disappeared, leaving the crew in stunned silence. The captain looked at the crystal in his hand. It was small, but it felt heavy with responsibility. "We need to get back to the ship," he said. "Now." But as they turned to leave, they heard a sound that made their blood run cold. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from the shadows. The crew froze. "What was that?" whispered the navigator. The captain didn't answer. He just tightened his grip on the crystal and motioned for the crew to move. They ran through the halls, the sound of footsteps echoing behind them. Whatever was in the shadows, it was following them. When they finally reached the shuttle, they didn't stop to look back. They launched into the sky, leaving the ancient city behind. But as they looked down at the planet, they couldn't shake the feeling that they had awakened something that should have stayed buried. Back aboard the Starwood, the crew gathered in the briefing room. The crystal sat on the table between them, its soft blue glow casting eerie shadows on their faces. No one spoke for a long time. The weight of what they had discovered hung heavy in the air. The captain broke the silence. "We need to figure out what this is," he said, gesturing to the crystal. "And we need to find out who, or what, we're up against." The engineer leaned forward, studying the crystal closely. "It's some kind of energy source," he said. "But it's unlike anything I've ever seen. It's alive, in a way." "Alive?" asked the navigator, his voice tinged with fear. "Not alive like us," the engineer clarified. "But it's generating energy on its own. And it's connected to something big." The captain nodded. "We need to access the data we collected from the planet. Maybe we can find more clues about this enemy." The communications officer worked quickly, pulling up the holographic recordings they had made in the ancient city. The images flickered to life, showing the murals and the holographic warnings. "Look at this," she said, zooming in on one of the murals. It showed the shadowy figure from before, but this time, the details were clearer. The enemy was tall and skeletal, with glowing red eyes and long, claw-like hands. Its ships were sleek and angular, designed for destruction. "They're not just conquerors," said the navigator, his voice trembling. "They're hunters." The captain frowned. "What do you mean?" "Look at the way they're depicted," the navigator explained. "They're not just attacking. They're stalking. They're toying with their prey." The room fell silent as the crew absorbed this. The enemy wasn't just powerful, it was cruel. "We need to find out more," said the captain. "If we're going to fight them, we need to know their weaknesses." The engineer nodded. "I'll see if I can interface the crystal with our systems. Maybe it can give us more information." As the engineer worked, the rest of the crew reviewed the data. They found more recordings, each one more chilling than the last. The ancient civilization had tried to fight back, but their weapons were useless against the enemy. Their cities were destroyed, their people slaughtered. "They didn't stand a chance," said the communications officer, her voice filled with despair. "We do," said the captain firmly. "We have the crystal. And we have their warning. We won't make the same mistakes." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over him. The enemy was out there, somewhere in the vastness of space. And they were coming. Suddenly, the ship's alarms blared. "What's going on?" shouted the captain. The navigator checked the sensors. "We've got incoming," he yelled. "Something's coming out of hyperspace." The crew rushed to the bridge, their hearts pounding. On the view screen, they saw it, a massive ship, sleek and black, with glowing red lights along its hull. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. "That's them," whispered the navigator. "That's the enemy." The captain clenched his fists. "Raise the shields. Prepare for evasive maneuvers." But before they could react, the enemy ship fired. A beam of red energy shot across the void, striking the Starwood's shields. The ship shuddered violently, and the crew was thrown to the floor. "Shields at 60%, yelled the engineer. "Return fire," ordered the captain. The Starwood's weapons lit up the darkness, but the enemy ship dodged effortlessly. It was fast, too fast. "We can't hit it," shouted the navigator. The captain gritted his teeth. "Keep trying. We can't let them." Before he could finish, the enemy ship fired again. This time, the beam tore through the starwood's shields like they were paper. The ship rocked violently, and sparks flew from the consoles. "Shields down," yelled the engineer. "We're defenseless." The captain stared at the view screen, his mind racing. They were outmatched. There was no way they could win this fight. But then, something strange happened. The crystal on the table began to glow brighter, its light filling the room. The enemy ship hesitated, as if sensing something. "What's going on?" asked the communications officer. "I don't know," said the captain. "But we need to get out of here. Now." The navigator worked frantically, plotting a course out of the system. But before they could jump to hyperspace, the enemy ship fired one last shot. The beam struck the Starwood's engines, and the ship was thrown into a spin. The crew held on for dear life as the ship tumbled through space. When they finally regained control, the enemy ship was gone. "What just happened?" asked the navigator, his voice shaking. The captain looked at the crystal, which was still glowing softly. "I don't know," he said. "But I think it saved us." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They had survived, for now. But the enemy was still out there. And they would be back. The Starwood drifted in the void, its engines damaged and its crew shaken. The enemy ship had disappeared, but the crew knew it was only a matter of time before it returned. "Report," said the captain, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. The engineer checked the systems. "Engines are down. Shields are offline. We've got minor hull breaches on decks 3 and 4, but the bulkheads are holding." "Can we get the engines back online?" asked the captain. "I'll try," said the engineer. "But it's going to take time." The captain nodded. "Do it. We need to be ready to move when they come back." The crew worked quickly, their movements sharp and focused. The crystal sat on the console, its glow a constant reminder of the danger they were in. "Captain," said the communications officer, her voice tense. "I'm picking up something on the long-range sensors." The captain turned to her. "What is it?" "It's another ship," she said. "But it's not the enemy. It's human." The crew exchanged surprised glances. They were in uncharted space, far from any human colonies. What was another human ship doing out here? "Hail them," ordered the captain. The communications officer opened a channel. "This is the mining ship Starwood. Identify yourself." There was a moment of silence, and then a voice crackled over the comms. "This is Captain Reyes of the Eclipse. We read you, Starwood. What's your status?" The captain let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "We've sustained damage in an encounter with an unknown hostile. Engines are down. We need assistance." "Understood," said Captain Reyes. "We're on our way. Hold tight." The crew waited anxiously as the Eclipse approached. It was a sleek, military-grade ship, much larger and more heavily armed than the Starwood. When it finally came into view, the crew couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. But that relief was short-lived. "Captain," said the navigator, his voice urgent. "The enemy ship, it's back." The crew turned to the view screen just in time to see the enemy ship emerge from hyperspace. It was closer this time, its red lights glowing like eyes in the darkness. "Eclipse, do you see that?" asked the captain. "We see it," replied Captain Reyes. "Prepare for battle." The two human ships moved into formation, their weapons trained on the enemy. But the enemy ship was fast, too fast. It darted between them, firing bursts of red energy that tore through the Starwood's already damaged hull. "We can't take much more of this," yelled the engineer. The captain clenched his fists. We need to buy time for the eclipse to take it down. Target its engines. The Starwood fired, but the enemy ship dodged effortlessly. It returned fire, striking the Starwood's weapons array. Weapons offline, shouted the navigator. The captain cursed under his breath. They were sitting ducks. But then, the Eclipse launched a volley of missiles, forcing the enemy ship to evade. The missiles detonated in a burst of light, momentarily blinding the enemy. "Now's our chance," said the captain. "Get the engines back online." The engineer worked frantically, his hands flying over the console. "Almost there, got it. Engines are back online." The captain didn't hesitate. "Full power to the engines. Get us out of here." The Starwood surged forward, but the enemy ship was already recovering. It fired another beam, striking the Starwood's hull. The ship shuddered violently, and the crew was thrown to the floor. "Hull breach on deck 2, yelled the engineer. "Sealing it off." The captain struggled to his feet. "We need to." Before he could finish, the crystal on the console began to glow brighter. The light filled the bridge, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow down. The enemy ship hesitated, as if sensing something. "What's happening?" asked the communications officer. "I don't know," said the captain. "But we're not sticking around to find out. Navigator, plot a course out of here." The navigator worked quickly, and the Starwood jumped to hyperspace, leaving the enemy ship behind. When they finally emerged in a safe system, the crew let out a collective sigh of relief. But the captain knew it wasn't over. The enemy was still out there. And they would be back. The Starwood drifted in the safety of a distant star system, its crew battered but alive. The crystal sat on the console, its glow dimmer now, as if exhausted from whatever power it had unleashed during the battle. The crew gathered around it, their faces etched with a mix of awe and fear. "What is this thing?" asked the navigator, breaking the silence. The captain stared at the crystal, his mind racing. "I don't know," he said. "But it's more than just a power source. It's connected to something. Something bigger." The engineer leaned forward, studying the crystal closely. When it glowed, the enemy ship hesitated. "It's like they were afraid of it. Or they recognized it," said the communications officer. "Maybe it's a weapon. Something the ancient civilization created to fight them." The captain nodded slowly. "If that's true, then we need to figure out how to use it. But we can't do it alone." He turned to the communications officer. "Open a channel to the Eclipse. We need to share what we've found." The Eclipse responded quickly, and soon Captain Reyes's face appeared on the view screen. "What's your status, Starwood?" she asked. "We're holding together," replied the captain. "But we've found something. Something that might change everything." He held up the crystal, and Captain Reyes's eyes widened. "What is that?" "We're not entirely sure," said the captain. "But we think it's a weapon. Something the ancient civilization created to fight the enemy." Captain Reyes frowned. "If that's true, then we need to get it to command. They'll know what to do with it." The captain hesitated. "There's a problem. The crystal, it's tied to this ship. We can't just move it. And even if we could, I'm not sure we should." "What do you mean?" asked Captain Reyes. The captain took a deep breath. "When the enemy attacked, the crystal reacted. It protected us. But I think it's more than just a weapon. It's alive, in a way. And it's connected to this ship, to us." Captain Reyes was silent for a moment, considering this. "If that's true, then we need to figure out how to use it. But we can't do it alone. We need to regroup and come up with a plan." The captain nodded. "Agreed. But we need to move quickly. The enemy will be back, and next time, they'll be ready." The two ships set a course for a nearby outpost, a small station on the edge of human space. It wasn't much, but it was a place to regroup and repair. As they traveled, the crew of the Starwood worked tirelessly to learn more about the crystal. The engineer interfaced it with the ship's systems, and they discovered something astonishing. "It's not just a weapon," said the engineer, his voice filled with wonder. "It's a key. A key to something much larger." "What do you mean?" asked the captain. The engineer pulled up a holographic map. "The crystal is connected to a network of ancient technology scattered across the galaxy. If we can activate it, we might be able to turn the tide against the enemy." The crew stared at the map, their minds reeling. The ancient civilization had left behind a legacy, a way to fight back. But it would come at a cost. "There's a catch," said the engineer. "The network is dormant. To activate it, we'd need to use the crystal as a catalyst. But doing so would destroy it." The room fell silent. The crystal had saved them, protected them. It was more than just a tool, it was a part of their ship, a part of their crew. "We don't have a choice," said the captain finally. "If this is our only chance to stop the enemy, then we have to take it." The crew nodded, their faces grim. They knew what had to be done. But as they prepared to activate the network, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to lose something irreplaceable. The Starwood and the Eclipse arrived at the outpost, a small, heavily fortified station orbiting a barren moon. The crew wasted no time. They docked the Starwood and began transferring the crystal to the station's main control room. The station's commander, a grizzled veteran named Colonel Harris, met them as they stepped off the ship. "This had better be worth it," he said, eyeing the crystal skeptically. "It is," said the captain. "But we need your help to activate it." Colonel Harris nodded. "Let's get to work." The crew worked quickly, connecting the crystal to the station's systems. The engineer explained the plan. The crystal would act as a catalyst, activating the ancient network and giving humanity a fighting chance against the enemy. But as they worked, the station's sensors picked up something alarming. "Captain," said the navigator, his voice tense. "We've got incoming. Multiple enemy ships." The captain cursed under his breath. "How long do we have?" "Not long," replied the navigator. "They'll be here in minutes." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They were running out of time. "We need to activate the network now," said the captain. The engineer nodded. "I'll do it. But once I start the process, there's no turning back." The captain placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do it." The engineer worked frantically, his hands flying over the console. The crystal began to glow brighter, its light filling the room. The station systems came to life, and a holographic map appeared, showing the ancient network spreading across the galaxy. "It's working," said the engineer. "But it's going to take time to fully activate." The captain turned to Colonel Harris. "We need to hold them off." Colonel Harris nodded. "We'll do our best. But we're outgunned." The crew rushed to their stations, preparing for the battle ahead. The station's defenses powered up, and the Eclipse moved into position, its weapons ready. The enemy ships arrived in a flash of light, their sleek, black hulls glinting in the darkness. They moved quickly, surrounding the station and opening fire. The station's defenses returned fire, but the enemy ships were fast, too fast. They dodged the incoming fire with ease, their red beams tearing through the station's shields. "Shields at 50%, yelled one of the station's crew. "Keep firing," ordered Colonel Harris. The Eclipse joined the fight, its missiles streaking through the void. One of the enemy ships was hit, its hull cracking under the force of the explosion. But the others kept coming, relentless and unstoppable. On the Starwood, the captain watched the battle unfold, his heart pounding. They were holding their own, but barely. How much longer? he asked the engineer. Almost there, replied the engineer, his voice strained. But we're going to need more power. The captain hesitated. The crystal was already glowing brightly, its light almost blinding. But if they pushed it too far, it could overload. Do it, he said finally. The engineer nodded and increased the power. The crystal's glow intensified, and the station systems began to hum with energy. But the enemy wasn't going to let them win without a fight. "Captain," shouted the navigator. "One of the enemy ships is breaking through." The captain turned to the view screen just in time to see an enemy ship slip past the station's defenses. It fired a beam of red energy, striking the station's hull. The station shook violently, and the crew was thrown to the floor. "Hull breach on Deck 3, yelled one of the station's crew. "Sealing it off." The captain struggled to his feet. "We need to." Before he could finish, the crystal began to pulse, its light flickering. "It's overloading," shouted the engineer. "We need to shut it down." "No," said the captain. "We're too close. Keep it going." The engineer hesitated, then nodded. He worked quickly, stabilizing the crystal as best he could. The station's defenses continued to fire, but the enemy ships were closing in. The Eclipse was taking heavy damage, its hull riddled with holes. "We can't hold them off much longer," yelled Colonel Harris. The captain clenched his fists. They were so close. They couldn't give up now. Suddenly, the crystal's light flared, and the station's systems surged with power. The holographic map lit up, showing the ancient network coming online. "It's working," shouted the engineer. "The network is activating." The crew watched in awe as the network spread across the galaxy, its light pushing back the darkness. But the enemy wasn't done yet. "Captain," shouted the navigator. "The enemy ships, they're retreating." The captain turned to the view screen. The enemy ships were pulling back, their red lights flickering as they disappeared into hyperspace. The crew let out a collective sigh of relief. They had done it. But as the crystal's light dimmed, the captain knew it wasn't over. The enemy would be back. And next time, they would be ready. The station was in shambles. The battle had taken its toll, and the crew worked tirelessly to repair the damage. But despite their exhaustion, there was a sense of hope. The ancient network was active, and for the first time, humanity had a fighting chance against the enemy. The crystal, now dim and cracked, sat on the console. It had done its job, but the cost was clear. The engineer examined it carefully, his face grim. "It's spent," he said. "We can't use it again." The captain nodded. "It served its purpose. Now it's up to us." The crew gathered in the control room, their faces etched with determination. They knew what was coming. The enemy would regroup, and when they returned, the battle would be even fiercer. "We need a plan," said the captain. "The network is active, but we need to use it to our advantage." Colonel Harris stepped forward. "The network gives us access to the ancient civilization's technology. If we can harness it, we might be able to turn the tide." The engineer pulled up a holographic map of the network. "There's a central hub, a massive station hidden in a remote system. If we can reach it, we might be able to amplify the network's power and use it against the enemy." The captain studied the map. "How long will it take to get there?" "A few hours," replied the engineer. "But the enemy will be watching. They'll know where we're going." "Then we'll have to move fast," said the captain. "Prepare the ships. We leave immediately." The crew worked quickly, preparing the Starwood and the Eclipse for the journey. But as they worked, the captain couldn't shake the feeling of unease. They were walking into a trap, and they all knew it. As the ships prepared to depart, the communications officer approached the captain. "There's something you need to see," she said. She led him to a small room where a holographic recording was playing. It was the ancient figure from before, its glowing eyes filled with sorrow. "If you are hearing this," it said, "then you have activated the network. But beware. The enemy will stop at nothing to destroy it. To protect it, you must make a sacrifice." The recording ended, and the room fell silent. "What does it mean?" asked the captain. The communications officer hesitated. "I think it means that someone will have to stay behind. To protect the hub." The captain's heart sank. He knew what that meant. Someone would have to give their life to ensure the network's survival. He returned to the control room, where the crew was waiting. He explained the situation, his voice heavy with emotion. "I won't order anyone to stay behind," he said. "But if we don't protect the hub, everything we've fought for will be for nothing." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. They knew what was at stake. Finally, the engineer stepped forward. "I'll do it," he said. The captain shook his head. "You're too valuable. We need you." "I'm the only one who knows how to operate the hub's systems," said the engineer. "If anyone stays behind, it should be me." The room fell silent. The crew knew he was right, but that didn't make it any easier. The captain placed a hand on the engineer's shoulder. "Are you sure?" The engineer nodded. "I'm sure." The crew prepared for departure, their hearts heavy. The engineer stayed behind, his face calm but resolute. As the ships launched, the captain looked back at the station. He knew they might never see the engineer again. The journey to the hub was tense. The enemy was watching, and they knew the crew was coming. But the Starwood and the Eclipse pressed on, their crews determined to see the mission through. When they finally reached the hub, it was a massive, ancient structure, its surface covered in glowing symbols. The engineer's voice crackled over the comms. "I'm in position," he said. "I'll activate the hub's defenses and hold them off as long as I can." The captain nodded. "Good luck." The engineer's voice was steady. "See you on the other side." The crew watched as the hub's defenses came online, its weapons powering up. They knew the enemy would be here soon. And when they arrived, the battle would be unlike anything they had ever faced. The ancient hub loomed before the Starwood and the Eclipse, its massive structure glowing with an otherworldly light. The crew could feel the power radiating from it, a testament to the advanced technology of the civilization that had built it. But there was no time to marvel. The enemy was coming. "All systems ready," said the navigator, his voice tense. "We're as prepared as we'll ever be." The captain nodded, his eyes fixed on the view screen. "Stay sharp. They'll be here any minute." The crew waited in tense silence, their hearts pounding. The engineer's voice crackled over the comms, calm but resolute. "The hub's defenses are online," he said. "I'll do everything I can to hold them off." The captain clenched his fists. "We'll be right there with you." But before he could say more, the sensors lit up. "Enemy ships incoming," shouted the communications officer. "Multiple contacts." The crew turned to the view screen just in time to see the enemy fleet emerge from hyperspace. There were dozens of them, their sleek, black hulls glinting in the darkness. They moved quickly, surrounding the hub and opening fire. The hub's defenses responded immediately, its weapons lighting up the void. The Starwood and the Eclipse joined the fight, their weapons firing in unison. The battle was fierce. The enemy ships were fast and relentless, their red beams tearing through the hub's shields. But the hub's defenses were powerful, and the human ships fought with everything they had. "We're holding them off," shouted the navigator. But the captain knew it wouldn't last. The enemy was too numerous, too powerful. "We need to buy more time," he said. "Target their lead ship." The Starwood and the Eclipse focused their fire on the largest enemy ship, its hull bristling with weapons. The hub's defenses joined in, their beams striking the ship with incredible force. The enemy ship shuddered under the assault, its hull cracking. But it wasn't enough. "Their shields are too strong," yelled the engineer over the comms. "We need more power." The captain hesitated. The hub's defenses were already at full capacity. But there was one option left. "The crystal," he said. "We can use it to amplify the hub's power." The engineer's voice was strained. "If we do that, it'll overload. The hub will be destroyed." The captain clenched his fists. "We don't have a choice." "Do it." The engineer hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." The crew watched as the hub systems surged with power, the crystal's light flaring brightly. The hub's weapons grew stronger, their beams cutting through the enemy ships with ease. But the enemy wasn't done yet. "Captain," shouted the navigator. "They're targeting the hub's core." The captain turned to the view screen just in time to see the enemy ships focusing their fire on the hub's central structure. The hub's shields flickered under the assault, and the crew knew it wouldn't hold much longer. "We need to stop them," yelled the captain. The Starwood and the Eclipse moved into position, their weapons firing relentlessly. But the enemy ships were too fast, too numerous. The hub's shields failed, and the enemy's beams struck the core. The hub shook violently, its structure beginning to collapse. "It's overloading," shouted the engineer. "Get out of here." The captain hesitated. "We're not leaving you." The engineer's voice was calm but firm. "You have to. It's the only way." The crew watched in horror as the hub's core began to glow brighter, its light filling the void. "All ships, retreat," ordered the captain. The Starwood and the Eclipse pulled back, their crews watching as the hub's light grew brighter and brighter. And then, with a final, blinding flash, the hub exploded. The shockwave tore through the enemy fleet, destroying their ships in an instant. The Starwood and the Eclipse were thrown back, their shields barely holding. When the light finally faded, the enemy fleet was gone. The crew sat in stunned silence, their hearts heavy. The hub was destroyed, and the engineer was gone. But they had won.